Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today with SchoolHouse Connection and the Learning Policy Institute on supporting students experiencing homelessness with American Rescue Plan funds. My name is Erin Patterson. I am the Director of Education Initiatives at SchoolHouse Connection, and we're so glad you could join us today. As we get started, I just want to offer a few pieces of housekeeping. First of all is that this session will last 1 hour and 15 minutes, and we are recording, so it will be posted to our archived webinars page on the SchoolHouse Connection website after. And we ask that you please type your questions in the Q&A box, and we will promise to get to as many of them as time will allow today. If you're not familiar with SchoolHouse Connection, we are very glad that you're here. And just a little bit about us, we are a national nonprofit advocacy organization, and our mission is overcoming homelessness through education. We work at that goal on several levels. We do some federal and state policy advocacy. We offer a great deal of practical assistance to state education agencies, school districts, early childhood programs, and institutions of higher education. And we also say the jewel in our crown is our network of young scholars who have themselves experienced homelessness and who we are privileged to support both with scholarship support, but also case management as they pursue their post-secondary careers. You can find out more about us on our website, schoolhouseconnection.org, and we encourage you to sign up for our e-newsletter, which comes out about once a week. I'm very excited to be joined today by SchoolHouse Connection's Executive Director, Barbara Duffield, who you'll hear from in just a few moments. But first, I'm happy to turn it over to Danny Espinoza at the Learning Policy Institute to kick us off.
Thank you, Erin. And good morning, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. I'm a researcher and policy advisor at the Learning Policy Institute, and LPI is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that conducts and communicates high-quality research to improve education policy and practice. And for the last couple of years, we've been doing some research exploring educational opportunities, funding opportunities, and outcomes for students experiencing homelessness. And so appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit about that work with you all today. And on the next slide, we start with just the headline number, which is that about 1.2 million students were identified as experiencing homelessness in grades pre-K through 12 in 2021, 2022. Which is overall about 2.4% of all students in those grades. However, research and evidence kind of suggests that that number is almost surely a significant undercount of the overall number of students experiencing homelessness. And I say that for two reasons in particular. There's actually, the first of which, there was a analysis by SchoolHouse Connections back in 2020 that was drawing on the Youth Risk Behavior Survey data. And that's important to know because that's an anonymous survey, which means that students responding to that survey might feel a little bit more comfortable reporting their housing status, that certainly sidesteps some of the stigma that we see related to housing insecurity. And what was found from that data was that pre-pandemic, schools had been identifying only about slightly more than half of high school students experiencing homelessness. In addition to that, from the national data, we also see that districts, a number of districts identify 0 students as experiencing homelessness, and that's despite these schools serving, or districts and schools, I should say, serving populations of socioeconomically disadvantaged students. And we can kind of think of a benchmark of between 5 and 10% of those students as might be experiencing homelessness. And so to kind of see 0 identification numbers is kind of an evidence of some of the challenges related to identification, which this next slide kind of shows a little bit about. You can see some of the dip in total identification numbers in recent years. Certainly part of that is driven by the impact of COVID-19, the complications that had on identification. I think Quintina and Jessica are liaisons with us today, might be able to speak to that in a little bit more detail. But what we're seeing at a national level in any case is that some of those numbers are starting to rise back to what we were seeing pre-pandemic. And I think the trend that we saw is likely not a reflection of reduced rates of homelessness for students and families, but rather a reflection of some of the challenges for identification during that period. On this next slide, we have a breakdown of the housing types that are included in the Kinney-Vento Education Act. And you can see around 76% of families are identified as staying doubled up, at least at that moment of first identification. But the other housing types are unsheltered, hotels and motels, and shelters and transitional housing. Now, these rates are relatively stable year to year. So you're looking at data from 2021 to 2022, but at least at a national level are fairly consistent. And I think that that doubled up category in particular, it's important one to emphasize because this form of homelessness can, in some cases, be less visible, right? Might not go detected by staff. Certainly, staff don't have like the training to understand that as a form of homelessness in particular, right? So when a family is, staying temporarily with a relative or a family friend, while they look for something more permanent, if they are eligible for supports and protections under McKinney-Vento. And unfortunately, right, we also know that homelessness and living situation isn't static, right? It changes during the year. And so a family might stay there welcome, with that family friend and then have to move to a shelter or a motel during the year. And I note this in part as well because the HUD definition, the Housing and Urban Development Department definition for homelessness includes shelters and unsheltered, but doesn't include doubled up, and only in really limited situations is assistance able to be provided for those in hotels or motels, which of course could complicate the provision of services and supports for families and students experiencing homelessness. But to share a little bit more about the impacts of this, I want to pass it to Barbara.
Great, thank you, Danny. So again, we're really sort of setting the stage for best targeting the American Rescue Plan Homeless Children and Youth Fund. So as Danny mentioned, identification continues to be a big struggle, and that any capacity that's added to improve identification is definitely a great use of ARP HCY funds. But also in thinking about what we know about students who are experiencing homelessness and how to connect it to the resources that are available, it's important to think about the impact of homelessness on health and well-being. So this slide looks at some of the findings from the Centers for Disease Control, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey that Danny mentioned earlier, specifically that students who experience homelessness are at much higher risk of experiencing violence, so 2 to 4 times higher for sexual and physical dating violence, and also for mental health issues, specifically in this study looking at much higher risk of suicide. So nearly twice as likely to have seriously considered suicide or made a suicide plan, and more than 3 times as likely to have attempted suicide. So mental health support's absolutely critical piece in terms of thinking about how we use available funding and supports. Now on the next slide, looking at the actual impact of homelessness on attendance and achievement. And again, really thinking about how do we connect all of this research to the ways in which we're using funds. Chronic absence, much higher rate for students who are experiencing homelessness, twice the rate of stably housed students, big impact on academic performance and on high school graduation. And the piece I really want to emphasize here with academic performance and high school graduation is that homelessness has an impact above and beyond poverty. So it's not just the experience of being in a low-income family, that homelessness, the trauma takes a toll on our academics. And so specialized services and attention are really needed there as well. And on the next slide, just again, a refresher, we know many of you may be McKinney-Vento liaisons, maybe from McKinney-Vento world, but for those of you who are joining for whom this is a relatively new topic, just again, a quick refresher about the main educational protections for students experiencing homelessness is that McKinney-Vento Act education subtitle, liaisons that have 10 very specific duties. We have representatives here from school districts who are living this out, but those key protections to mitigate the impact of homelessness on enrollment, attendance, and success, immediate enrollment, staying in the school of origin, training for school personnel, and really eliminating those barriers to full participation. So wanted to make sure we at least had a little bit of a primer here for those of you for whom this is a new topic. And with that, I think I turn it back over to, oh no, I almost turn it back over to Danny, just to emphasize why in the fight against homelessness, education is so imperative. It is where we see students and families first. It is where we deliver services, but also the education itself is protective against future homelessness. Lack of a high school diploma or GED is the single greatest risk factor associated with continued homelessness as a young adult. So while homelessness has an impact on education, education is vital to ending the cycle of homelessness, and really want to emphasize that. And just, of course, the wage disparities for workers who have some high school degree versus those who do not. And with that, now I turn it over to Danny to set the stage to talk about funding, and then we'll get into our conversation about ARP.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara. We can be relatively brief here. I know we've both done work on looking at federal and state funding opportunities to support students experiencing homelessness. We'll focus first just on the federal funding opportunities, of which there's three kind of primary federal education funding sources. So Barbara mentioned the Kenny-Bento EHCY program. That's the dedicated annual funding, most recently funded at $129 million. In addition, through the American Rescue Plan Act, Congress allocated $800 million in one-time funding specifically for supporting students experiencing homelessness. And as I'm sure many on this call are aware, right, those funds must be obligated by next September 30th, 2024, and then spent by January 31st, 2025. And then finally, within the Elementary Secondary Education Act, or ESSA, for Every Student Succeeds Act, there's a requirement that LEAs, local education agencies, set aside a portion of their Title I Part A funds to support students experiencing homelessness. And excitingly, for the first time soon, we'll have the first national look at how much districts are setting aside in these Title I dollars, because for last year, 2022-23 school year, was the first time that states had to calculate that amount and report out how much LEAs were reserving through the Title I set aside. But I know, Barbara, I'll pass it to you to kind of share a little bit about some of the funding challenges that we've seen at the federal level related to these funding sources.
Thanks, Danny. So again, this is sort of setting the stage for the importance of this moment and having these additional funds, American Rescue Act funds, prior to ARP-HCY. The regular annual appropriation from Kenny-Bento is about $130 million. And at that funding level, we're looking at really 1 in 5 school districts nationally getting some dedicated funding to identify and support students experiencing homelessness. We also know that having a little bit of funding dedicated towards this, even a small amount, is correlated with better identifying students who are experiencing homelessness. So when we look at the school districts that reported a 0 in terms of who they were identifying, 92% of those districts had no Kenny-Bento funding. So our ARP-HCY funding is more generous. It's one time. We know that at this amount, over half of school districts are getting some dedicated funding support. So a big change from 1 in 5 to over half of all those districts. And we also know that we need to continue this and look to ways to sustaining. So for example, the Title I set aside is going to be one piece to really look at seriously in terms of sustaining the work that we can do with ARP-HCY, in addition to, of course, advocating for more federal funds. And on the next slide, just to get a little more specifically into ARP, our main topic today. So we have brand new guidance from the U.S. Department of Education that just came out that we'll share some more on in the next couple slides, but just looking at the broad buckets of how these funds can be used specifically to help students experiencing homelessness, they tie back into all of those challenges that we talked about earlier. So transportation, more flexible funding around transportation to enable students to get to school on a regular basis. So that's a big issue. The supplies, the basic to show up every day to school with what you need to be successful in school, to feel like all the other students. So they can be used for supplies and prepaid store cards to help flexibly get that. Cell phones, technology, motel stays. We'll talk more about that. Our panelists will talk a little bit about that. That's new and unique to ARP-HCY funds. Those wraparound services, and then just increasing the capacity, whether it's through extending contracts or additional hours. More hands on the ground to help identify and support our students. So just quickly to talk about some of the highlights of the new guidance, the federal guidance, and then we'll have our conversation with our experts in school districts. So again, this came out just a couple weeks ago. If you click, when you get the PowerPoint, you click on that, it'll take you right to the letter. One of the things it does is it asks states to expedite funding. We have 1 year left. So it really asks states to look at what they can do to modify those administrative procedures, things like procurement and contracting and all those bureaucratic processes that get in the way. So the first order of business here is to get this letter out. There are a lot of things that are coming out. So download this letter, circulate it to anybody you're working with, whether it's superintendents, school business officers, or anyone who's involved in those spending decisions. And on the next slide, we just want to highlight a couple of the things that are new in this guidance compared to what first came out in April of 2021. So first of all, the department clarified that most motel stays of longer than 3 days are allowable if they're reasonable and necessary to allow children and youth who are homeless to attend school, and also as a last resort when other funding resources are not available. So that's a change that is definitely a change from previous guidance. It's a clarification that it can be longer. Purchase of vehicles also was clarified, including reimbursing parents and youth for gas, prepaid gas cards, limited car repairs. And again, for all of these, it's under the rubric of if reasonable and necessary to allow children and youth to attend school and be successful in school. They also clarified that food assistance if reasonable and necessary. So that was something that was added. And then on the next slide, a couple of things that we want to call attention to, again, that were allowable but weren't really spelled out. One is a whole area of activity around early childhood education. We know that many young children who are experiencing homelessness, and they only get identified if somebody at the school is asking about younger siblings. So it's allowable to use ARPHCY funds for early childhood education, transition to kindergarten, screenings, referrals, early intervention, including transportation. So that's something to keep in mind as we look at this ARP sprint in the last year. And then also a whole series of activities around that transition to higher education, whether it's help with the FAFSA, dual enrollment, college application fees. They really went into much more detail about that too. So we just want to highlight it again, that because this is new and we wanted to get the word out, wanted to highlight that. And I believe with that, we transition back to Erin, who's going to moderate our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you both, Barbara and Danny. That was a great overview. I can tell by the enthusiasm of our audience today in the chat and the Q&A. And I want to reassure everyone, you will get a link to these slides and you will get a link to this recording after. I know there's been a lot of interest in the data that you both shared. And so we want to make sure that we get that out to everyone. I'm going to stop sharing the slides because I want to welcome in Quintina Brown and Jessica Trimble to our conversation today. And just a note for our audience, we're going to walk through a facilitated conversation over the next several minutes with Quintina and Jessica, and then we're going to open it up to audience questions. And so we encourage you to continue using that Q&A box, and I will do my best to monitor and transition us over to your questions. But Quintina and Jessica, first of all, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. We are counting on you to help us make sense of all of this information and help paint the picture of how this is playing out on the ground in your districts. And so the first thing we want to do is invite you to introduce yourselves. And so Jessica, we'll start with you. If you could tell us about your district, where you're located, the size, and the number of identified students experiencing homelessness that you are serving.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Trimble. I'm the supervisor of the Counseling and Student Services in Clifton, New Jersey. So it's a very urban city. We currently have 3 preschools, 14 elementary schools, 2 middle schools, and 1 high school. So it's a very large district. With that being said, last year we had approximately 10,820 students. And of those students, approximately 50 students were classified as McKinney-Vento. This year, our numbers are pretty similar. We currently have 10,900 students, and at this point, we have 33 students that have been determined to be McKinney-Vento students.
Thank you. And Quintina, same question for you. Please introduce yourself and tell us about your district.
Good afternoon. My name is Quintina Brown, and I have been a liaison for 14 years here in Lafourche Parish. We're down in southern Louisiana, and it's a rural area. Our district was hit with Hurricane Ida 2 years ago, which had a significant impact on numbers. We have about 14,000 students, 30 schools, which 3 of them are high schools. We have 2 charter schools, and then one of our charter schools is spread out throughout the district. My numbers consisted of this year right now I'm at 650 students. Last year, our October count was about 892 students. The year before with Hurricane Ida, we had about 900 for October count, and we ended that year with 1,427 students identified. And then with our COVID year, we had 443 for October count. We have about 87 SPED students that we service. And like I say, today we have about 650 that we have identified before the October 1st count.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm seeing reactions from folks in the chat. It can be surprising to hear some of these numbers for the first time, and to recognize that homelessness is that prevalent in our community. So thank you both so much for putting some quantitative numbers to that. We want to hear from you a little bit more about what you're seeing in your districts. And so, Jessica, let's start with you for this one. Just tell us about the needs you've seen among your students experiencing homelessness in your district.
Sure. So I just want to start by saying, when we were notified that we were going to receive this large amount of ARP funding, we thought it would be beneficial to kind of see areas of improvement of how we could better identify our students as well. So what we did is we added specific questions to our registration process to help us identify students that could be McKinney-Vento when they first registered for our school district, as well as we have trained all of our staff. Just a quick 20-minute video just to help them better identify and see if there was any concerns, and then they would reach out to me. So that has really helped identify students. In saying that, when meeting with the students after they have been identified, the main areas that we felt that they needed the best support were the basic needs. So it was laundry kits, hygiene kits, and clothing, as well as mental health supports, housing and motels. In our area, a lot of our shelters have been filled to capacity, so they needed that extra location to stay in the interim until they found another location to stay, as well as transportation.
Thank you for that. And Quintina, same question for you. Tell us about the needs you're seeing.
Some of our district needs right now is housing. Like I said, we was hit with Hurricane Ida. We have a lot of families that are living in campers right now, still living in campers right now. And a lot of families can't afford, FEMA is now renting to the families, the campers at a fee that the families just can't withstand. So housing has been terribly affected, because our only shelter in the area that housed families was destroyed during Hurricane Ida. So our families have to now go to either New Orleans or further away if they want to seek shelter, which that's a barrier for them, because they don't want to leave their families, their surrounding families. So that is a biggie. Also, we've seen the mental health issues within the families, the housing. So the housing, which we needed to do the hotel and motel stays with the ARP funds, which was a significant help for our district, and the transportation. But we're still seeing barriers from Hurricane Ida in the future.
That's helpful. And Quintina, I want to stick with you for this next question, and then we'll go back to Jessica. Based on these needs, based on what you're telling us, would love to hear how you're using your ARP-HCY funds to meet those needs. And specifically, how is that process working? How have you been able to get those spending expenses approved in your district?
Okay, so one way is identification. With the ARP funding, I was able to hire an community outreach person to go into the communities, put out letters, talk to businesses about what McKinney-Vento is and how we identify our families, and how we can collaborate on services with other businesses and community resource agencies. So I was able to provide a community outreach specialist. I was able to pay for part-time case managers to go into the schools. Also pay for LPCs to go into the schools with the mental health, to meet one-on-one with our McKinney-Vento students. And they also do group sessions if they can. Community outreach person, the LPC, we all attend anything community. If we can go and give out pamphlets to families, any support, any mental health resource fairs, any school meetings, PTO meetings, anything that we can sit in and give parents information on our program, we attend. You'll see us coming in our blue shirts, because we have program shirts, just so we can be known. that we're here. We're here to service our students. We also do a big parental day we host at the beginning of the school, like in July. That way we invite families to come in and get assessed. We do a short program. It's a short program, maybe in half an hour. And I also invite community resource agencies to come out and also support us. That way we're able to collaborate with businesses and also have them on site for the families at the beginning of school. And at that big event, we advocate, talk about the program in details, also talk with the parents about the stigma of homeless, because a lot of them don't want to be identified as homeless, and getting that pushed away. I also host beginning of the year planning meetings. That's where we all, the district, my CWA, my director, me, my case managers, we all sit at a table. We talk about transportation. We talk about program services and what we can do, how we can collaborate and get child welfare there with us, where they can also distinguish the difference in families and how to identify the families. And they also know to call me if they have any questions. So that's some of the things that we do within our district to help identify. And that's some of the things that I use the ARP money for.
You are staying busy for sure. And I want to go to Jessica and ask you the same question. How have you been able to use your ARP HCY funds to meet the needs you're seeing?
Yeah, so I think Quintina kind of mentioned where we started as well, was just really communicating with our community resources to help create that partnership, and then that way we can support our families. So in saying that, we partnered with a hotel in our district, and that way we kind of set up that partnership. So when we did have families in need, it was a quick phone call to set up the hotel stay and have the students and families within the hotel within like an hour or two, which was incredibly helpful. In saying that, we also used the funds for a mental health clinician. So we hired them last year part-time. So they are available Tuesdays and Thursdays for our students, which has just been like a huge asset for our students. Our families don't have to worry about transporting their child after school. They don't have to leave work or anything. The clinicians go to the school building and meet with the students to provide any mental health supports that they can. And then they've also created that like partnership liaison with the family. So myself, as well as the clinician, will kind of touch base with the families every other month just to see how they are doing, how they're adjusting, and if any of their, if they needed any additional supports. And so some of the supports that we have been super helpful are the gift cards. So we have worked with ShopRite in our community of food store, where they have endless amounts of gift cards, whether they're gas gift cards, clothing gift cards. What we've noticed too is additional, in the beginning, I purchased a bunch of different gift cards, whether it was Old Navy, Marshalls, things of that nature. And I kind of, based on working with our families, we realized that a lot of our families are using Old Navy. It's easier for them to order online. There's an Old Navy store right next to the hotel too, so convenience. So kind of just testing it out and seeing what worked for our families was really helpful. So we used a lot of our funds for the gift cards as well. In addition to clothing and gas, we were also able to buy, whether it was like Domino's or pizza, just in case they needed to order food of that nature. And then at ShopRite, we were able to purchase items to create the hygiene kits, school supplies. For the hygiene kits, we created different bags for women, men, as well as children. We had first aid kits. We purchased laundry kits in case families needed to do their laundry at a laundromat. And then we were able to purchase school supplies. So often throughout the year, other companies have donated backpacks. So then we were able to purchase the school supplies to fill them as well. So it was just helpful, having that clinician and myself to kind of meet with the families, see what they were in need of. And then that way, when we check in, we can see what other items that, they could use throughout the year. One of the things that our district does provide is transportation, as long as the students who in district are utilizing transportation based on where they live. So if it's over a certain amount of mileage, then we provide transportation. If we were not able to set up transportation within a timely manner, and or if we had to outbid for services, then we would provide our families with gas gift cards until we were able to set up transportation, which usually at max takes about a week. So then that was helpful for our families too, so they could still be able to take the students to school until we were able to set up transportation. Some of the things that we did set aside money for, which we kind of found we didn't need as time went on, was for cell phones. We've noticed that a lot of our families, no matter what, did have cell phones and cell phone services. And we also allocated money for tutoring. Fortunately, our school district has a lot of like after school clubs and programs that focus on the academics where students could attend as well. So that necessarily wasn't one of the needs that we needed to utilize our funding for.
This is super helpful to hear. And Jessica, I'm going to stick with you now for our next question and then go back to you, Quintina. Hearing you describe all the amazing things you're able to do with your ARP-HCY funds, I think we would love to know what other funding sources are available to you to meet these needs for your students experiencing homelessness, and how have you been able to utilize other funding?
So I also work with our assistant superintendent, who she's kind of responsible for our Title I funds. So we kind of have worked together to see what our students are in need of to provide those extra supports, whether I can utilize the funds through ARP funding, and if not, see if it would fall under the Title I funds as well.
And Quintina, how about you? You had some larger numbers of students identified. You've done some great things with your ARP-HCY funds. What other funding sources are you able to utilize to meet those needs?
We do operate with the Title I set-aside funds. Also, we received the McKinney-Vento competitive grant. And also, I also invest my time in looking for community grants with businesses or other additional companies and donations. That's some other things we use in our district. So, yes, ma'am.
And then Quintina, we'll stick with you. This is my last question for you, but we have so many questions coming into our Q&A panel and our chat. And so want to make sure we're getting to those. Would love to know if you thought about sustainability of all this. ARP-HCY funds, as Barbara noted earlier, will expire September 30th, 2024 is the obligation deadline. January 2025 is the liquidation deadline. So have you thought beyond ARP-HCY, and what would you need to be able to sustain these services?
So to sustain the services, I will utilize my McKinney-Vento grant. There's things in the ARP funding that you cannot provide from that grant. So with that being said, I always look for additional grants. And that's why I'm always networking with different businesses and companies on collaborations, and then to find out if there's a grant or something that I can apply for to sustain services. And donations, because we do collaborate with, like the bank has this Pack the Bus for us, and that eliminates us have to spend so much money on supplies. So I'm just always out networking, advocating, networking, and trying to collaborate in order to sustain my services for families.
Jessica, how about you?
So I think the gift cards will be incredible. I mean, you can purchase gift cards and they don't expire. So the amount that we were able to purchase can really carry us through years, I would say, because we were awarded a great amount of money. With that being said, too, we also, the first year we hired the part-time clinician, and then we were able to do it again this year. We paid up front just to make sure that we had the services. And in doing that, it gave us 2 years to make sure that we can hire a full-time clinician within our district budget, which we were able to figure that out. So our school district does hire 3 full-time clinicians. In the past, we had 2. So right now we're beyond lucky. We have 3.5. So once we're not able to use the ARP funding anymore, then at least we still have the quote unquote manpower of the Tri-County clinicians. to help service our students who need any mental health support. And just like Quintina too, I mean, we do have fundraisers within our district that might provide for our students, as well as donations that we collect from the community members as well.
That's so helpful. Thank you so much. I want to quickly turn to Danny, and Danny, invite you in on this funding conversation and see if there's any additional context you can provide about other state-specific funding that might be available to support students experiencing homelessness.
Sure, thanks, Erin. Yeah, it's some of our research has looked into state investments within education support these students, and broadly speaking, right, there's about 44 states in DC that provide within the broader school funding formula, sort of at-risk funds, which it's typically targeted towards students that are eligible for free or reduced price meals, which is categorically includes students experiencing homelessness. And at least for folks in some contexts, I can cite a couple of examples now, but if folks are interested in connecting back afterward, please do reach out of kind of particular at-risk funding programs with defined in like statute or in guidance with allowable uses for students experiencing homelessness. So for example, in Minnesota, they have their special education aid and formula includes transportation funding for maintaining school of origin. Ohio has a couple different at-risk funding programs that define in statute as services for students experiencing homelessness as one of the allowable uses. It's amongst a broader list, and so at least at a local level, right, there could be varying priorities for those dollars, but at least for folks in Ohio, there might be some opportunities there. And similarly in Texas, they have what's called the state compensatory education program, and that's a different type of at-risk funding, but it includes actually a dedicated weight for students experiencing homelessness, right? So if districts are identifying students experiencing homelessness, they'll be generating additional funds, and so the intention being with those dollars should also go to support those students directly. And unfortunately, what we've seen kind of nationwide is there's only a small number of states that provide sort of targeted or directed funding for students experiencing homelessness in particular. So California did that with their as a portion of the broader ESSER funds, the federal relief funds. They distributed that to LEAs as $1,000 for each student that districts were identifying. Colorado has a education stability program for, in this case, it's both students experiencing homelessness and students in foster care, but we know there's an overlap between these two student groups. And kind of interestingly, I think there was a comment in the chat around prevention. One thing that we saw in Maine that certainly we'll be kind of tracking in the coming years was that just in this legislative session, they established a grant or pilot program for it'll distribute $750 for each family of students experiencing homelessness. It'll go to McKinney-Vento liaisons, and they could use that kind of cash assistance for emergency financial assistance for families, with the intention of, particularly for supporting families on that front end before they ever kind of fall into housing instability. Maybe that's for, car repair, maybe for overdue utilities, things like that, can all too frequently kind of lead to experiences with homelessness. There's a couple other kind of state grant programs and things like that. So at least for, I should say Massachusetts, New York have kind of transportation funding. Washington has a couple competitive grant programs that sort of supplement McKinney-Vento. And so, sustainability picture, at least in a couple states, might be a little bit more broad from what state dollars, legislatures have put to supporting these students.
Thank you so much for that, Danny. And just a note to our audience, we just shared the link to the slides in the chat, and that those slides not only include the data and everything that Barbara and Danny went over, but also some of that state-specific information that Danny just shared as well. So I encourage you to check those out. I am excited to turn to our Q&A now. We have tons of questions coming in. I've been keeping an eye and noticed a couple of themes coming up. So I have a couple specific questions that I want to ask of Quintina and Jessica to start, and then I'm going to ask or warn Barbara to be on deck, because I think we may need to do some rapid fire allowable uses questions about the ARP HCY funds and the updated Dear Colleague letter. But there were 2 or 3 things that are coming out that people want to know from you first, Jessica and Quintina. I'll leave it up to you who wants to jump in and start. But the first thing is a lot of interest in knowing how you were able to use your funds to pay for motel stays? Did you get a voucher? Is that an MOU contract? How are you able to navigate that piece of it?
So I can share. We were not able to create a contact with the hotel. It was basically just a communication of partnership of just that we might have families that would be in need. And the day that we would be notified that a family was in need, we would call the hotel. They would provide us the monthly rate. So it did change here and there, the nightly rate, sorry, not the monthly rate. And then we would just send over the information, and they would be able to create that contract at that moment. So it was on a moment's notice. And I think that was kind of just the partnership and the communication that we had, just of that we would need, to utilize your hotel for some of our families. We would be paying. One thing that we did have to do is my business administration did draft a check. So we were able to create a check that day to pay for it. So we did have to pay for it before the family did arrive. But I think that's what was really helpful was my BA as well as the hotel working quickly together to make sure that our families were able to use the hotel within hours.
For LaFouche, we were able to use our funding from hotel and motel stay. So when ARP first came out and they gave me the guidance, I provided it to my director first, and we talked it over. Eloise, hold on. I know y'all gonna pick up feedback from me. But I was able to meet with my director and talk it over with her first. And at first we put out a letter within the community. We visited each hotel with a packet, information packet on McKinney-Vento, what it was. We composed a letter, just giving them more information on the program, stating who they can contact, letting them know that we would be checking the families in. The families had to sign off on some paperwork, rules and regs kind of, that we would be checking them in, that we would be doing visits, come and check on them. And we were able to establish a rapport with one of the hotel owners. She knew to call us if there was any problems. She knew my contact and whoever was assigned to the case as the case manager contact. And that rapport made her more comfortable with providing services for our families. So I did compose a letter that I put out to different hotels just to give them information on what is McKinney-Vento and why we're doing the services that we're providing for our families.
That's so helpful. Thank you both so much for sharing that process. I want to acknowledge a couple of things that have also come into the chat that I think are good examples for our audience as well. Similar to what both Jessica and Quintina were describing, it really comes down to the liaison, forging that relationship with your local community partners, including hotels and motels. There are some resources. One is I linked to SchoolHouse Connection's Flexing the Flexibility of ARP HCY series, which has a special installment on motel stays and offers some sample resources and processes. And I want to acknowledge one of those links that we include is to the California Homeless Education Technical Assistance Center, or HETAC, which someone else also noted has some really good sample forms. The other piece I want to ask you both, Quintina and Jessica, is we seem to get a lot of questions about store cards. And the first thing to say is that yes, to those participants who say my business office won't let me call them gift cards, we often hear that. And so the first step I think that's been successful is people calling them store cards. But I'm wondering if you can describe, because you both talked about needing those store cards to meet those basic needs. I wonder if you can describe how you've been able to, how does that fly in your district? How have you been able to help calm some of the fears that your business officers might have and still be able to get those resources to families?
So once again, I think it's more of educating, advocating, and talking with your director. It was hard at first for my district. So what we did, we had to explain to them our tracking. We're going to track the cards. We're going to, families will sign off. They sign off on receipts. Even if we used to give cards to go in the store with the family have to sign off on that they receive the items, and the gift card is stored in the student file folder. So it's a lot of tracking that you have to provide to get the business office kind of comfortable. And I don't have, I think Ms. Jessica has a better tracking system than I have, which I've learned from her. So it's just getting them on the boat, explaining to them of what you're going to do with your procedures, and following through on that.
So I think for my district, Quintina's right. It's all just a matter of communication and getting, your business officers and your directors on board. I fortunately did not have a lot of pushback in that regard. When our families do fill out the paperwork, they are asked of what they are in need of, and just having the conversation. I think that there was documentation from the beginning, just kind of showing of what they're in need of, whether it was clothing, food, etc. And then once we are able to identify where their needs are, I do have a tracking system of the quantity of how many gift cards we give out, how much the gift cards are worth. And when meeting with the families, we kind of talk about, what they are going to purchase. A lot of times too, like Quintina said, sometimes the families do order items in my office and we use the gift card together. So then that way I technically have a receipt, and I just kind of put everything together in the student file. But again, like, we haven't had pushback in regard to, saying the name store cards instead of gift cards. So that I think has been really helpful, having that support from the district.
This is so helpful. I want to acknowledge and thank Barbara for being here. I know she has another call to get to. Barbara, if there are any last words that you have for us, now is your moment.
Okay, so I scheduled myself poorly today, so I'm sorry I have to leave early. I'm scanning the questions about allowable uses of funds, and there's sort of two things I'm seeing. One are sort of like, can we do it? And the other was, how do we do it? So the how do we do it questions are really where Quintina and Jessica are going to be able to tell you like how we did it. And we also have examples from other school districts that we're working with. Some of the questions around allowable uses of funds, for example, I see a question about bedding, and the Department of Education has said yes to things like bedding and pillows. So that I know for sure they've said yes to. So that's one that we can answer. The other question is about, I saw a question about like a district that requested 2 weeks in a motel as reasonable and necessary. The department did not put a maximum or a minimum. So sometimes 2 weeks is going to be reasonable or necessary because shelters are full, or that's as long as it takes. So, the language about unreasonable and necessary, and when there's no other funding as a last resort, is really important. So it might very well be that you can't get into a shelter, you can't get into a housing program, you can't get in anywhere. So I think that one is case by case. That's the other mantra that we have there around allowable uses. I saw a question around materials for laundry kits, hygiene kits, etc., as needed. That also we know the department has said yes to. So again, we're basing our responses based on what we've heard other people do. There was a question around groceries and food as well. And I just want to share one example that actually one of our staff from a district in Virginia, and I think what they did around that issue, so the answer is, again, yes, with this umbrella of reasonable and necessary, and if not otherwise provided. But there was a district she talked to who allotted about $100 per identified student for groceries and $200 for seasonal clothes. And the counselors worked with the oldest students in the family to gather information on what the whole family, all the children in the families need. And then they ordered it all online with the older students, and then they delivered it to the families. So again, these answers around allowable uses are case by case. The department has definitely, for families who are not yet homeless, that's really challenging. These funds are for students who meet that McKinney-Vento definition. So we don't have really great answers there. And then the last thing I'll say is just that all of this is evolving. We had when the department announced the guidance, they answered some questions online. We weren't allowed to record that session, but the department is working on written responses. So that's going to be super helpful too. So keep your eyes out for that. I know it's really helpful to have something official and have something in writing. And to be able to cite chapter and verse. So please know that hopefully will be coming to coming soon. Erin, is there any sort of like questions that are particular Barbara questions?
I am amazed and impressed at the speed with which you covered all the things that I was hoping you would cover. So thank you for that.
All right. So, and again, just to listeners, we're in it with you. Please let us know what we can do to help. If you need resources, if you need individual advocacy, please call on us for this. We're entering the sprint time, and we want to be as of service to you and of service to the children, youth, and families. So thank you.
Thanks, Barbara. Quintina and Jessica, I'm going to come back to you because we have more questions for you. Everyone is just so intrigued to know how you're doing all the wonderful things you're doing. We had a question come in that says for Quintina, but I think both of you want to invite both of you to respond. Quintina, we'll start with you. It says, did you have to create a committee or a plan for input on how to use these ARP-HCY funds? And was there a needs assessment or community input done?
So no, I didn't have to utilize. I utilized my federal programs director, and we talked it over. I include her on all information, all trainings, anything that comes out from the State Department, she is notified on. So once we received that guidance, I sat down and we met on the needs, kind of did like an outline. What works, what we were seeing that was needed, and she actually took it up to the big man. So yeah, so me and my federal program director, we are very close. We have a good rapport, and I think it starts there. Who's ever over you, I think that advocating, letting them know, letting them be on meetings, including them, plays such a big part.
Jessica, same question for you. Just curious if you created a committee or needed to get input or a needs assessment done in order to use these ARP-HCY funds.
Sure. So I did not create a committee. I worked very closely with my business administrator as well as my director of operations and student services. And what we kind of did in the beginning, which I think I mentioned before, is we really looked on how we can improve by identifying and then how we can make sure that the funds would be sustained as time went on. So it was more of just a conversation of just ideas of where I personally felt like I could improve upon as the liaison, where the district could improve upon regarding the needs and how we can utilize the funds. So it was really just a matter of working together and communicating where we had concerns and then how we can improve upon it.
Thank you for that. There are a couple questions that have come in about food. And so I want to just spend another second or so there and then invite both Jessica and Quintina to offer any ways that they've been able to use ARP-HCY funds for food related expenses. As Barbara noted earlier, food is an allowable use of ARP-HCY funds. That was emphasized in the recent Dear Colleague letter that the Department of Education released last week, or maybe that was 2 weeks ago. I can't tell time anymore, but it is a new emphasis. And again, those caveats all remain true. If reasonable and necessary, and if all other funding sources have been exhausted. And so there are instances that we hear, for example, where a district liaison, for whatever reason, free and reduced price meals are not available. There are not Title I funds available. There are not EHCY or regular McKinney-Vento funds available, and this child needs food. One instance we heard recently was it was a Friday, and without using these ARP-HCY funds to cover the cost of food for the weekend, this child would likely not eat over the weekend. And of course, in addition to that being inhumane, that's going to impact that child's ability to show up for school well on Monday. So again, encourage you all to work with your local officials, your state education agency partners, but do know, like I love Quintina said, I took the Dear Colleague letter to my district partners and showed them, point to it and say, the department said that this is an allowable use of funds. And so just want to open it up to you, Quintina and Jessica, if you have any instances where you have been able to provide food or see needs for food among students in your districts.
I will say that most of our families that have been identified are in need of food. So we do provide them with the ShopRite gift cards, especially if they're staying at the shelters. I'm sorry, not the shelters, the hotels. So I'll work with the hotels kind of to see if there's a room that has like a larger refrigerator, see the size to make sure that we're ordering the right foods, whether it's milk, to make sure that everything will be able to fit and that they have the space as well. And sometimes our families do not have transportation. So the benefit of utilizing ShopRite is they're able to set up that delivery as well. So they can deliver it to the families at the hotel. And so that has been the main source. So we do provide breakfast and lunch to our students. But like you mentioned before, Erin, at night and on the weekends, they may not be able to, the families may not be able to provide the food. So even just providing those gift cards where the families can make sure that there's food for them has been really beneficial.
So with LaFouche, we have seen the need for food more when placing families into the hotel motels. We did use some money for like parental events with our families. If they had kids here, we supplied food for them. What else we did food? I think that's about it for our district with the food.
That's so helpful. I noticed a couple questions have come in that remind me that not everyone on this call is a school district homeless education liaison. And so want to sort of back up and zoom out a minute. And Quintina, I think this is in reference to a comment you made earlier about your blue shirts at the beginning of the year when you're going into schools and talking in the community with families. And so would love for you both to share just what your identification process looks like. The specific question was, how are you able to get schools to let you in to talk to your students? And so just want to remind our audience that the duties that Quintina and Jessica are describing are actually required. And so these are federally mandated duties, but would love for you both to share more about how you do that identification, both at the beginning of the school year and throughout the year. What are the signs? How are you able to build that trust with students and families?
So I think for myself, again, I mentioned before that we added certain questions to our registration process. And I think where my office is, I'm right in front of where families register. So I'm like right there. I'm always in the front. So right when they are able to answer these questions and we can potentially identify that they might qualify, it's that quick communication and that like meet and greet that I can have with them and just have that friendly conversation just to be able to, comfort them, because sometimes it is a difficult situation on the reasoning why they are displaced or homeless. And then offering what I can in regards to support. So for me, at least, it's that quick identification, which I can read the 4 questions that we've added that have been super helpful. The first is this student's home address a temporary living arrangement? Is this a temporary living arrangement due to loss of housing or economic hardship? Is this student in temporary or emergency foster care placement? And is the student not living with a parent or legal guardian? So just by having answers to these questions are really able to help us identify the students. And then as I mentioned before, I'm the supervisor of the counseling department. So I'm in the buildings all the time as well. So a lot of times too, I will check in with the school counselors as well as like I kind of just pop into the classroom. I have that flexibility to kind of be present. So when they do see me in my office in the beginning of the year and then throughout the building, it's that, again, that familiar face. And then I'm also able to check in with the families throughout the year. So it's just that constant communication, that constant relationship. And some of our families who may no longer qualify, I still keep in touch just to make sure that they know that they have a liaison from the school district that can support them, whether they are displaced or not. So I think that has been super helpful.
So what has been helpful for us is the parental day for one. I think when I first hosted the parental day, we might have had like 30 families attend. And this year we had 85 families attend. Then I also meet with our school counselors. We have a beginning of the year counselors meeting that our child welfare and attendance hosts. And federal programs is part of that meeting. Where we get to talk to the secretaries about welcoming families, making them feel safe, and to notify our counselors. I also host a counselors day with our district counselors, where everybody comes to my office. We compose an agenda with different trainers, consultants to come in and meet with the counselors, and also our state coordinator sits in on that counselors meeting. That way our counselors are know about McKinney-Vento, are able to talk about McKinney-Vento with our families, and they usually touch the families first because our families register at the school, and then we call it a train-the-trainer process. So I train them. They are able to go out and train the staff at the schools. And so that process has been really helpful, along with working along with our child welfare and attendance department that has, in the beginning, it was like a strain, but through training and meeting and forming that collaboration and that communication, they know to contact me if they have any questions, if they feel if they suspect something or anything, they'll contact me. So it's building that relationship within the schools. We want our families to feel welcome and feel like that they can talk to anyone.
This is so helpful. I have two questions that I definitely want to make sure we get to, and then I'll check in with our Q&A. I keep seeing our number tick up and up. The more you say, the more questions and interest people have, which is a sign of a great conversation. The first question that I want to make sure we address is specifically for you, Jessica, but then want to invite Quintina to offer any additional insights. So Jessica, you shared about paying in advance for your, I believe it was your mental health counselor in particular. And so there's some interest in knowing more about that idea. And the question is, paying in advance for an employee for 2 years, would that be a sustainable way to use the funds and then switch sources for other supplies, et cetera, through Title 1A set aside or McKinney-Vento if allowed to reallocate once ARP HCY funds run out? So wondering if you can just say a little bit more about the process and the decision that you came to do that prepayment and how it's going to help in the long run.
Sure. So I think when we first started this process, I was concerned that I had to spend all the money by September of 2023. So last year when we hired our part-time clinician, and it was an incredible resource, we paid monthly at that point. As the summer months approached, I was like looking at the funds and again, speaking of communication and partnership, I work very closely with this organization. And so we just had the conversation and I was like, I would love to be able to rehire. I don't know if I'm able to pay monthly. Would you accept if we just paid in full, which usually they don't deny that. And if we could just pay in full, then we have the services for the rest of the year. Fortunately, they were more than happy to accommodate us with that. And then in the interim, I was also working with the business administrator just to see the cost and see if we could add on another clinician within our budget. So it was, we were fortunate that we were able to. And so I do understand that. So with that being said, now that we have 3 full-time clinicians and our part-time McKinney-Vento clinician, next year, if we do not have available funds, at least we have the 3 full-time that would still be able to meet with any of our students in district, which would include our McKinney-Vento students.
Quintina, anything to add on that point?
No, we did hire the LPCs, but we contract them during the school year.
That's great to hear. My last question is either the best or the worst, depending on where you sit. I want to ask about transportation. I know this is an ongoing huge need that no one has a one-size-fits-all solution to. We've gotten a few questions about either using ARP HCY funds for transportation. Are you able to pay for Ubers if they're available in your area, sort of what's allowable in your district? And then would love for you to just tell us a little bit about the transportation picture in general and the challenges that your students experiencing homelessness face where you are.
So with transportation in Lafourche, we have established a wonderful relationship with our transportation department, and it's all about communication once again. We provide needed transportation. Our transportation supervisors normally link up with the neighboring district's supervisor, and we provide the transportation. I did go out in the beginning and compose a letter for the taxi companies to try to contract with taxi companies, but we know taxis is, we have to act in the best interest of the child and in the safest interest of the child. Usually when you're using taxi companies, if it's a pre-K student, the parent has to ride with them and stuff like that. So I haven't, besides with in-house transportation, we haven't did any Ubers because we're in a rural area and Uber is not available to that means. But other than the letter to the taxi companies and our district level transportation, that's what we've done in Lafourche.
So to kind of feed off of that, we were notified that we shouldn't be using Uber gift cards. So I believe I might have purchased a few in the beginning of the year, and then it switched and we weren't allowed to. And so we do not offer Uber gift cards any longer. Our bus situation is that our students, like I think I mentioned before, is that our students are able, as long as based on a certain mileage. So I believe it's elementary if it's 1.5, and then middle is 2 miles, and then high school is 2.5. If you're in that walking distance, then whether you are displaced or homeless or just another student in the district, then you don't receive transportation. If you are over that mileage, then we will provide transportation for you. Our biggest hiccup, unfortunately, is that a lot of our students who are displaced are not housed within our town. So when that arises, then we have to outsource other busing companies. And sometimes it does take a week to set that up. It is obviously a different cost than if we were going to use our busing services, but we kind of have worked those funds out within other budgets as well as using ARP funding. And transportation is a big it's a big cost, which we kind of realized this past year. We had a couple students that were being transported based on the parent and student wishes, almost over an hour each way. So the expense of just transporting the student was over about $80,000 just for the one student for the year. So it's hard to kind of plan that you're going to have to pay that expense, but we kind of just worked it out for our families to make sure that if they felt that staying in our district was best for the student, then we were able to fund busing for them. And then in saying that too, if we are not able to set up busing as quickly as we would like, if the parent had to drive and or if they had to take the bus, we provide the gift cards for gas. And then I've also worked with our community bus, and they have provide like bus passes to give to families if they are in need. Usually our parents do have transportation. We just need to support them with the gas cards.
We also utilize the reimbursement, reimbursing the family for transportation. So if the family has transportation and can provide it, if we can't, they're given a mileage sheet, and they keep documentation and turn that in at the end of the month, and we reimburse the family.
That's super helpful. And Danny, just want to invite you in to share anything that you're seeing on the research side related to transportation in particular.
Sure, thanks, Erin. Yeah, I would just know, I'd commend you both on kind of your efforts to maintain school of origin. I know the cost can be high and the logistics and all the people involved challenging. But what we see from like a research side is, LPI had done some research looking at educational opportunities and outcomes for students in California in particular that are experiencing homelessness. And, there was a significant decrease when we were looking at rates of, passing the state standardized achievement or standardized test scores. And so students experiencing homelessness that didn't have a school move during the school year, right, were achieving or meeting or exceeding state standards at a much higher rate than those that had one or two or more school moves, right? And this is for both English language arts and math. And so, I think we can all kind of understand the instability that comes with the school move. Underscore or add to that the housing instability that might precipitate that school move, and it kind of really paints a picture of the impact that has on students' learning opportunities in the classroom. Certainly from a social emotional standpoint, the relationships they have with their teacher and their friends that might get disrupted, and ultimately the impacts that we see from an academic side that has. And so, you know, the opportunities to maintain school of origin and really preserve that kind of measure of stability for students can have a really big impact.
Thank you so much for that. I want to field one more question, and I'm going to put a link to a resource in the chat. And want to also acknowledge that my teammate Karen Rice is on this webinar. Thank you, Karen, for dropping the link to the Dear Colleague letter in the chat earlier. And Karen is also our internal expert on immigrant and migrant issues, particularly those families experiencing homelessness. And we had a question come in about how do you work with immigrant and migrant families? How do you help them? How do you identify them, particularly when there might be a language barrier? And so want to first offer those resources in the chat, and then leave it open to you, Quintina and or Jessica, if you have any helpful tips or things that have worked in your districts and communities.
So that has been a huge factor for us. We have a very transient community as well. Within our registration department, though, we do have multiple secretaries that speak different languages that I think has been helpful in communicating with them just to see what type of supports and resources that they could benefit from. And then a lot of our buildings, whether elementary, middle, or high, do offer those additional classes and support, whether it's like ELL classes and whatnot. So still supporting the student. I did try to make sure when we hired our clinicians that one was definitely Spanish speaking. We do have a large Arabic population. So we're still looking, you know, for other languages to make sure that all of our students are receiving the supports that they need. But when working with them, we did try to factor the language component and students coming from different countries into the registration process, meeting and greeting. So they did have another staff member that spoke their language, and then still able to provide supports to them in their language.
So I communicate with our EL migrant coordinator here in federal programs for our immigrant students, and we collaborate on services that we need to provide for the families. But so it's more of a collaboration with me with the EL migrant coordinator in the FUSH.
That's so helpful. Thank you both for that. I want to move to wrap us up. I want to be respectful and mindful of everyone's time. I am just overflowing with both great ideas that you have shared and immense gratitude for everything that you all are doing on the ground to make sure that our students experiencing homelessness are identified, seen, and served. I cannot thank you enough. I want to remind and reassure our participants that you will receive a follow-up email that will include a link to today's slides, which has the contact info for Danny and Barbara, and also a recording of this webinar. And it will be posted on the SchoolHouse Connection website as well. Give us about 24 hours to make sure we can get that up for you, but it will be on our archived webinars page. With that, I just want to say huge thank you, Jessica Trimble, Quintina Brown, and Danny Espinoza for joining us today and for helping us understand ARP HCY funds and how they can be used to meet the needs of students experiencing homelessness. To our participants, thank you so much for your enthusiastic engagement with our panelists today and for everything that you all are doing in your districts, communities, and states. Everyone have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.